This lesson is on the Crucible, and this is part one of a two-part series. In this lesson, I want to talk about the contexts and allegorical dimensions of the play. Now, the play really has two contexts. It has a historical context that the author, Arthur Miller, looked at as inspiration for the contemporary context in which he was writing, Joseph McCarthy's Red Scare that took place between 1950 and 1954. Before we move on, I want to look at this concept of allegory because the Crucible is historical fiction that's also allegorical of the moment and time period in which it was created, right? So an allegory is any poem, story, or other work of art that's highly or even completely symbolic or full of symbols. I mean, to the point that everything the character experiences or wears or does is somehow symbolic of something. Every setting detail, every visual element. In music, there can be motifs or chord progressions that are symbolic of something. So the allegory really is, the limit point of symbolism in art. And usually the allegory is symbolic of some kind of psychological or spiritual journey or process. Often the hero is representative of that coming to knowledge, that overcoming evil, that dealing with guilt, some kind of process like that. Right? So for his allegorical inspiration, Arthur Miller looked back at Salem in 1692 to the so-called witch trials, right? And this was a series of accusations of witchcraft made by young women and girls in the village of Salem, Massachusetts. And as the accusations and hysteria spread, judges were brought in to investigate the case and to try to figure out the source of witchcraft in Salem in 1692. And these people really believed this. They believed that witchcraft was a real thing and could be understood and manipulated and stopped. And these hearings led to confessions to avoid hanging, where very often the accused would give up the names of others who had supposedly practiced witchcraft in order to save him or herself. And all these accusations led to a series of hangings at the end of the trial. And I don't want to say too much more because this is the broad plot overview for Arthur Miller's The Crucible. So this is why I don't want to say too much more. Right? But I do want to give you some further information, some more background on the Salem witch trials. Now, if you're watching this lesson in the Moodle at mrbrayman.info, I'll provide links in the Moodle and the literature page to these YouTube videos. If you're watching this on YouTube, I'll put some hotspot links on the bottom here so that you can access these videos. The first one's quite short. I think it's only about 8 minutes or less, a quick background on the Salem witch trials. The one on the right is the longer History Channel video, much more detailed and involved. They're both great. I would suggest watching one of them if you're not familiar with the Salem witch trials from your history course. Now let's jump ahead to America in the 1950s, the context in which Arthur Miller was writing The Crucible. Right? And it helps to understand that the Soviet Union had emerged as and by that I mean the United States' main rival in foreign affairs after World War II. And this reached a boiling point in the Korean War, which lasted from 1950 to 1953. And this was a part of a broader climate of growing fear of communism as a worldview that was in direct competition to America's economic and political interests around the world. Right? Communism is antithetical or opposite to capitalism as a way to organize economies and the flow of goods and services and the concepts of ownership and private property. Communism is also, or was seen as a threat to the United States of America because it's atheistic and was viewed as a threat to America's religious culture as well. And so the whole world really came to be seen as a chessboard for the United States and the Soviet Union to work out, territorial and economic ambitions. And every smaller, usually developing or third world nation was territory to be fought over and controlled by the two great powers. The early 1950s was also the period in which the United States was developing the hydrogen bomb, which is a much stronger nuclear weapon in comparison to the uranium bombs that the United States had used against Japan at the end of World War II. Now, in 1953, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were brought up on charges of stealing nuclear secrets on behalf of the Soviet government and giving those secrets to the Soviet government. And history has shown that at least the husband, Julius, was guilty of stealing these secrets and transferring them to the Russians. And shortly after the execution of the Rosenbergs, the Soviets did manage to detonate their first hydrogen bomb. I think it was about 2 months after the execution of the Rosenbergs. And so it was kind of a scary time for the United States. We thought we had gained a technological and military edge over the Soviet Union, and they caught up with us almost instantly. So there's a very real threat from the Soviet Union that I think American teenagers nowadays just don't really take seriously. And so you're gonna have to take my word for it. I was a kid in the 1980s, and I can still remember when the Soviets were our great enemy and a group of people that we were very much afraid of. And my father fought in Vietnam, another one of these wars, these proxy wars between the United States and the Soviet Union for territory. And so, this was a very real present danger and a very deep fear in a way that, we're just not experiencing in the United States now when we think about groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and world terrorism, nowhere near the level of threat that the Soviets actually were. Right, and so in 1950, Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin began the so-called Red Scare, and he claimed that the State Department and other key federal agencies had been infiltrated by communists, and that these organizations weren't being tough enough on communism. And McCarthy gained a lot of notoriety and political success through these accusations and became really a big deal figure in the United States, which is kind of funny because he was a junior senator. He just really wasn't that important to begin with, but he showed that, by making these accusations, the small could become large and the relatively politically weak could become very, very powerful. And this reached a climax in 1954 when McCarthy accused the Army of being soft on communism. He was eventually censured by the Senate, and his popularity rapidly declined, and he died just a few years later of liver failure, probably brought on by alcoholism. So McCarthy was this meteoric figure who kind of came from nowhere and went back to being nowhere within a very short window, a very short period of time. Now, let's bring Arthur Miller into this. Now, Miller, of course, is the playwright who wrote The Crucible. In 1949, there was the first performance of his most successful play, Death of a Salesman. So he was entering, the national consciousness as a major playwright. And this was his second play to receive critical acclaim. And so, Miller was becoming kind of a big deal. In 1952, Miller's acquaintance, Elia Kazan, was accused and testified before McCarthy's House Un-American Activities Committee as an accused communist, and Kazan gave up the names of former communist collaborators, and this was, deeply hurtful to Miller, who saw, his friends selling out and giving up to this panel that was really running through Hollywood and major thinkers and writers and kind of accusing everyone. I think at one point, New York Jets quarterback Joe Namath was even accused of being a communist. So they were kind of going after everybody, and the fact that Kazan gave up all these names was terrifying to Miller. And so this is part of the context of the play, because in 1953, again, the same year as the Rosenberg trials, the first explosion of a Soviet hydrogen bomb, the Crucible opens. And people immediately understood that this play about the Salem witch trials was allegorical of what was going on in 1953 in American politics, so much so that McCarthy's House Un-American Activities Committee denied Miller his passport, wouldn't let him leave for London to see the opening of his own play, The Crucible. and later in 56, Miller testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee, and he was, interestingly enough, accompanied by his then-wife Marilyn Monroe. And in the trial, Miller admitted to his former communist activities, but he refused to name any communist collaborators. He refused to sell out and snitch, as it were, in the same way Kazan had. A move that was very similar to some of the action that we're going to see in the Crucible itself. Right, and so this is, Miller's allegory, right? He saw the HUAC's work and the witch trials as being analogous to one another, and he wrote the Crucible as an allegory of his own day, and he managed to write a very historically accurate play. He made a few alterations in characters and action in order to increase the dramatic impact of the play, but in some ways the play really can be read as a primary source document of the trials itself. Miller's work is that accurate and faithful to the history itself. All right, so this concludes part one, and in our next lesson we're going to look at some of the contextual and literary connections, and I also want to give you some notes about American plays in the early 20th century to help you read these types of plays more effectively and independently, and then finally we'll look at the dramatis personae, the characters in the play itself. And that's it. Thanks for watching.